The river was already swollen, its voice a growl that warned of disaster before dawn's light. The narrator whispered of nature's rage, unchained and merciless. The current churned with foam, dragging whole branches beneath the surface like a predator swallowing prey. Edward said, "The water is rising too fast." Martha replied, "It doesn't care who we are." Their children clung to them, eyes wide, breathing in terror. The wind carried the smell of mud and death, snapping reeds against the shore. Clouds pressed low, heavy with rain, suffocating the valley. The ground trembled, as if the earth itself recoiled. A single moment of stillness stretched, then the river broke free, ripping past the banks. The narrator declared, "No one is ready when the wild decides to take." In that instant, safety was gone, replaced by raw survival. Nature had begun its trial, and the family stood in its path. The narrator whispered that storms never ask permission. Edward pulled the children back from the collapsing edge, his grip fierce. Martha said, "It will take us all if we stand still." The current swallowed a fallen log, snapping it like a twig. The roar grew so loud it silenced thought, drowning even prayer. Daniel cried, "I can't breathe," as fear pressed his chest. The narrator said, "The river feeds on panic." Lily stumbled, mud pulling at her small shoes. The world became a blur of gray water, black sky, and breathless terror. Every heartbeat marked another threat. The family moved along the bank, each step a gamble against collapse. Lightning cracked, blinding white. The earth quaked under the river's surge, forcing them to face the truth. The water was no longer a river but a beast unleashed. The river snapped again, dragging entire trees into its maw. The narrator spoke of a predator without fangs, only endless hunger. Edward said, "We must run now." Martha clutched Lily tighter, shaking her head. The children cried, their voices drowned by thunder. The ground shook again, cracks forming beneath their feet. Daniel shouted, "It's breaking." The narrator declared, "The land itself betrays them." Fear swallowed courage, forcing each step to feel heavier. They stumbled along the shore, backs bent against the storm. The water surged, reaching for them, spraying cold against their skin. The family's breaths became short, sharp gasps. In the chaos, every sound carried the same message: nothing is safe. The narrator whispered, "Every step is stolen time." Edward's boots sank deep into mud, every pull harder than the last. Martha said, "The bank is crumbling behind us." Daniel tripped, screaming, as Lily tried to pull him up. The river roared louder, as if mocking their weakness. Thunder cracked like a whip overhead. Martha's eyes burned with fear, yet her arms held Lily close. Edward shouted, "Move," as the ground split where they had just stood. The narrator said, "Nature devours hesitation." They ran along the bank, breathless, blinded by rain. Lightning illuminated their silhouettes, a fragile family defying the storm. But even in their defiance, the river grew bolder, pressing closer, stealing their path. The narrator declared, "No refuge remains untouched." The family stumbled into a clearing where the river had already claimed the land. Broken trees lay half buried in water. Edward said, "We must climb higher." Martha nodded, her lips trembling, but her grip never loosened on Lily. Daniel whispered, "The river will swallow us." The narrator whispered, "Children see the truth, adults fear." The ground ahead tilted upward, but the slope was slick, mud sliding under every step. The roar behind them grew like an approaching monster. Martha's knees buckled. Edward caught her, forcing her upward. The children cried, faces streaked with rain and fear. The storm had taken the night, leaving no escape, only a fragile climb toward uncertain survival. The narrator whispered, "Fear is a storm, but love is the anchor." Edward pressed Daniel's hand into his own, gripping with force meant to reassure. Martha held Lily close, rocking slightly, though the ground shook beneath them. The river's roar echoed like a monster, yet the children's trembling breaths became louder in Edward's ears. Daniel cried, I can't keep up, his voice sharp with panic. Martha said, "You will because we are together." The narrator explained that strength does not come from muscle, but from bonds that refuse to break. Lightning carved white scars across the night sky, showing the small family as fragile silhouettes against the storm. Their clothes clung, soaked and heavy, but their hands never let go. The narrator said, "The river cannot drown what clings to hope." The narrator whispered, "Every fragile step is guarded by the will to protect." Edward scanned the slope ahead, calculating every risk. Martha said, "We climb now before it takes us." Daniel's legs shook as he tried to dig his feet into the mud, but Lily whispered, "I'll help you." The family's climb became a portrait of desperation, each pull against the slope heavier than the last. The ground slid under them, water streaming down like veins of the storm. Edward pressed his shoulder into the earth, pushing Daniel upward. The narrator said, "Sacrifice is silent, born in the smallest gestures." Lightning struck, illuminating the hill, showing their struggle as tiny figures in nature's fury. Yet still, they moved, refusing surrender. The narrator declared, "It is not strength but fragility that binds us most." Daniel slipped again, mud streaking his face, his cry piercing the thunder. Edward hauled him upward, his muscles straining, while Martha balanced Lily with both arms. Martha said, "Hold him steady, Edward." Lily whispered, "Don't let go." Their voices, fragile but insistent, echoed like prayers against chaos. The narrator whispered that hope is not loud. It is the trembling breath of a child who believes they are safe. The slope grew steeper, rain hammering against their skin. Every stumble became a threat, every gasp a reminder of what could be lost. Still, hand by hand they climbed, not as survivors but as one fragile flame refusing to extinguish. The narrator said, "To love in the storm is to stand against death itself." Edward's breath came sharp as he pulled Daniel onto firmer ground. Martha collapsed beside Lily, her hands trembling but never releasing her child. Daniel cried, "I thought I was gone." Edward whispered, "Not while I breathe." The narrator explained that these moments carve scars deeper than wounds. The storm raged louder, but the family's unity felt unbreakable. Lightning tore open the clouds, showing their small circle against the black night. In that fleeting instant, the river was only background, and the family was the story. The narrator said, "Love is fragile, but even fragility can resist the flood." The narrator whispered, "They do not see themselves as strong, yet strength lives in them." Edward pressed his palm against Daniel's chest, feeling the boy's racing heart. Martha kissed Lily's forehead, though her lips shook. Daniel asked, "Will it stop?" Martha answered, "Not yet, but we will not let it take you." The roar of the river swelled below, echoing like an enemy that would never rest. The narrator said, "Every fear becomes fuel when love demands survival." The family's breaths formed mist in the cold rain, proof of life clinging on. Their faces were streaked with mud and water, yet their eyes burned with the fragile fire of defiance. The narrator declared, "Fragile they may be, but in this storm they are unbroken." The narrator said, "When hope dares to breathe, the storm sharpens its claws." Edward steadied Daniel's trembling shoulders, but the slope above crumbled, spilling mud past their feet. Martha whispered, "We cannot stay here." Lily clung to her, burying her face in soaked fabric. The river below roared louder, climbing higher, swallowing trees whole. Edward said, "We must move faster." The narrator whispered that nature does not wait for courage to gather. Lightning cracked again, splitting the sky into shards of light. Daniel said, "It's chasing us." Edward replied, "Then we keep climbing." The storm pressed harder, as if determined to strip away every fragment of resolve. The narrator whispered, "Conflict comes not in silence, but in the roar of collapse." The family scrambled upward, feet sliding in mud. Edward pulled Daniel higher, his arms shaking with strain. Martha said, "Hold Lily tight, don't look down." Below them, the river surged, ripping away chunks of earth, carrying them like scraps of paper. Daniel gasped. "It's getting closer." Edward growled, "We don't stop." The narrator explained that every heartbeat became a battle between endurance and despair. Thunder rolled again, echoing like drums of war. Each breath grew heavier, each step steeper. The family was small against the rage, but still they climbed, chased by water that hungered for their fall. The narrator said, "Conflict is survival's cruel mirror. One misstep is the end." Daniel slipped again, his hands clawing at the mud. Edward seized him, pulling hard, mud streaking both their arms. Martha shouted, "Don't let go!" Lily cried, "Daniel!" Her small voice cut through thunder, sharper than fear. The slope quaked as the storm hammered the land. The narrator whispered, "When the earth turns traitor, every breath is borrowed." Edward gritted his teeth, hauling Daniel back, though his own legs trembled. Lightning flared, revealing the river rising closer, foam reaching hungrily. In that instant, the family's struggle became a portrait of despair, painted against the storm's merciless canvas. The narrator whispered, "Every step forward awakens a fiercer storm." The slope grew narrower, forcing the family to crawl. Edward pressed his hands deep into mud, dragging himself upward, pulling Daniel behind him. Martha cradled Lily's small body, shielding her from whipping rain. Daniel said, "I can't hold on." Edward replied, "Then I'll hold you." The ground trembled, a chunk of hillside sliding into the roaring river below. The narrator said, "Survival is not a choice, it is a demand." The family clung harder, breaths short, skin scraped raw. Still, the water climbed, chasing them, determined to erase every trace of their struggle. The narrator declared, "Despair is heaviest just before it breaks." The family reached a jagged outcrop, barely wide enough to rest. Edward collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, Daniel slumping beside him. Martha pressed Lily against her chest, her arms shaking, her lips murmuring silent words. The storm screamed above, lightning shattering the sky into fragments. The narrator whispered, "Conflict sharpens its edge when hope flickers weak." Edward looked upward, seeing only more slope, slick and steep. Martha said, "We can't stop." Edward replied, "Then we don't." Below, the river roared, closer than ever, a living shadow climbing to claim them. The narrator whispered, "Revelation hides within the storm's teeth." Edward steadied himself against the slope, eyes narrowing on movement below. Between flashes of lightning, dark shapes shifted in the current. Martha gasped, "It's not only the river." Broken tree trunks swirled, smashing against rocks like weapons. Daniel cried, "The water is alive." Lily whispered, "It's hunting us." The narrator explained that nature wears many faces: predator, protector, and executioner. Edward clenched his jaw, realizing the river carried more than water. It carried destruction sharpened into spears. Martha said, "If we fall, we won't just drown." The truth twisted their fear into something sharper. The river was not only rising, it was armed. The narrator said, "Every assumption bends beneath revelation." Edward pulled Daniel closer, shielding him from the view of splintered logs spinning below. Martha whispered, "It's tearing the forest apart." The storm's howl blended with the groan of uprooted trees. Lily asked, "Why does it want us?" Edward's voice was steady but hollow. "It doesn't want, it takes." The narrator explained that the river does not choose prey, but its indifference is more terrifying than hunger. Lightning struck again, showing entire trunks slamming together with violent force. Daniel buried his face against Edward's chest. The truth was undeniable. Survival now meant more than outrunning water. It meant escaping a storm armed with death itself. The narrator whispered, "The hidden truth does not comfort, it wounds." Edward's gaze lingered on the current, watching a massive trunk smash against stone, breaking into jagged shards. Martha said, "Even the forest is against us." Edward replied, "It's the same fight. Everything survives by taking." Daniel asked, "Then where do we belong?" The narrator explained that revelation carves deep. They were not prey or predator, only fragile witnesses caught in the middle of nature's endless war. Lily's tears streaked with rain as she whispered, "We are too small." Lightning cracked, exposing the truth in a single blinding flash. The river was not their enemy, nor their savior. It was fate, and fate carried no mercy. The narrator said, "Truth strikes hardest when it strips away illusion." The slope trembled, another crack splitting the mud. Edward shouted, "Climb!" Martha obeyed, clutching Lily as she scrambled upward. Daniel struggled, feet slipping, Edward dragging him forward. The river below screamed louder, hurling debris like arrows. Martha cried, "We'll never make it." Edward replied, "We don't have to beat it, only survive it." The narrator whispered that survival is not victory, but endurance. Lightning illuminated the family climbing into shadows, the world behind them swallowed by chaos. Revelation did not free them, it chained them tighter. They knew now the river would not rest until it erased them. The narrator declared, "Every hidden truth cuts deeper than fear." The family reached another ledge, gasping for breath, their faces streaked with mud and rain. Edward collapsed, his hands scraped raw. Daniel whispered, "The river can't stop." Martha said, "Neither can we." Lily's small voice trembled, "It will find us." Edward looked into the storm, his expression hardened. "Then we climb higher." The narrator explained that the revelation was cruel but necessary. The river was not a beast to outrun, nor a storm to outlast. It was the endless cycle of survival. Their hope was not to defeat it, but to endure long enough to matter. And so they rose, fragile but unbroken, against the merciless night. The narrator said, "The storm saves its sharpest blade for last." Edward hauled Daniel upward, but the slope gave way, mud sliding into the river below. Martha cried, "It's breaking apart." Lily clung to her mother's waist, sobbing. The roar behind them grew like thunder inside their chests. Edward shouted, "Faster!" His voice cracked with exhaustion, but his arms refused surrender. The narrator whispered, "This is the moment when survival is carved into the flesh." Lightning tore open the sky, revealing the river climbing closer, carrying boulders and debris in its furious current. Daniel gasped, "It's coming for us." Edward pulled him higher, teeth clenched, eyes blazing. The family had nothing left but the raw will to endure. The narrator whispered, "The climax is not a choice, it is an ambush." The slope shuddered again, throwing the family to their knees. Edward's hand slipped, mud tearing skin from his palm. Martha screamed, "Edward!" He grunted, grabbing Daniel before he slid away. Lily cried, "Don't let go." Thunder cracked like a hammer blow, shaking the valley. The narrator said, "Here the storm shows its true face. Merciless, magnificent, absolute." The river surged upward, spraying cold mist across their faces as if reaching for them. Edward shouted, "Move!" They scrambled higher, breath ragged, muscles failing, yet still they climbed, knowing each step might be their last. The narrator declared, "The storm takes its sacrifice." The ground behind them split open, an entire section of the slope collapsing into the river with a deafening roar. Edward turned, eyes wide, watching destruction devour their path. Martha screamed, pulling Lily away from the edge. Daniel cried, "It's gone." Edward said, "Then we climb or we die." The narrator whispered that climax is not measured in victories, but in what is torn away. Lightning lit the valley, showing their fragile figures against a torrent of chaos. The slope crumbled beneath their hands, yet they pressed upward, chased by a monster with no mercy, no end. The narrator whispered, "Every climax is a war between breath and silence." Edward dragged Daniel forward, his chest heaving, sweat and rain mixing with blood on his hands. Martha's arms quivered as she held Lily, her voice hoarse from shouting. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the storm as if day had returned for an instant. Daniel cried, "I can't go on." Edward roared, "You will." The narrator said, "Here is the heart of survival. One more step, though the body begs for collapse. The family's movements became desperate, primal, scraping upward with nails, teeth clenched, lungs burning. The storm roared louder, demanding their surrender. Still, they defied it. The narrator declared, "The climax is the heartbeat of despair and defiance." The family reached a jagged ridge, clinging to stones slick with rain. Edward collapsed first, his arms shaking uncontrollably. Daniel leaned into him, sobbing with exhaustion. Martha staggered beside them, clutching Lily, who buried her face in her mother's chest. The roar of the river below had not lessened. It had grown louder, hungrier, climbing higher still. Edward said, "It will not stop." Martha whispered, "Neither will we." The narrator whispered, "Survival is not triumph. It is the refusal to fall." Against the endless storm, battered and broken, the family stood together, fragile but unyielding. The narrator whispered, "When fury has spent itself, silence returns heavier than sound." The family clung to the ridge, soaked and trembling, watching the river devour the valley below. Edward's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, his eyes hollow. Martha stroked Lily's wet hair, whispering comfort words the storm swallowed. Daniel muttered, "Everything is gone." Edward said, "Not us." The narrator explained that resolution is not triumph, but survival against inevitability. Lightning flickered weaker, distant, and thunder rolled away like fading drums. Yet the river still raged, swollen and merciless, reminding them that its hunger was endless. The family sat in fragile silence, surrounded by ruin, breathing proof of their endurance. The narrator said, "Resolution lands like a weight, not relief but inevitability." Edward looked down, seeing shattered trees and drowned fields beneath the water's grip. Martha whispered, "The land is gone." Lily asked, "Will it stop?" Edward shook his head, voice low, "Not for us to decide." The narrator explained that survival is never victory, only a pause granted by chance. Daniel stared blankly, his small hands trembling against Edward's sleeve. Lightning no longer split the sky. Only gray rain lingered, steady and cold. The river's roar became a constant reminder. Nature does not forgive. The family knew this night had carved itself into their bones forever. The narrator whispered, "Resolution is cruel in its honesty. It spares no illusions." The family stood slowly, their bodies stiff with exhaustion. Edward lifted Daniel to his feet, his scraped hands trembling. Martha rose with Lily clutched against her chest, eyes scanning the drowned valley. Daniel whispered, "Where do we go?" Edward's voice was hoarse, upward still. The narrator explained that survival demands motion even after the storm has passed. The land below no longer belonged to them. It had been claimed. The ridge was narrow, slick with rain, yet it was the only path forward. The family moved as shadows against gray stone, fragile figures carrying the weight of loss. The narrator said, "Resolution ties back to the beginning. The river takes, and it leaves behind silence." Edward glanced at the valley once more, his face lined with grief. Martha whispered, "It could have been us." Edward replied, "It nearly was." The narrator explained that in survival, there are no victories, only debts unpaid. Daniel looked at his father with wide, questioning eyes, but no answer could erase what they had seen. Lily buried her face in Martha's shoulder, refusing the view. The storm was fading, but its shadow lingered in every breath. The narrator whispered, "The storm is over, but its echo remains forever." The narrator declared, "Resolution does not soothe. It brands itself upon the soul." The family continued along the ridge, steps slow, clothes heavy with water, eyes empty with exhaustion. Edward said, "We are still here." Martha whispered, "For now." The narrator explained that survival in nature is never permanent. It is only borrowed time. Below them, the river raged on, carrying with it the broken pieces of the world they had known. Daniel asked, "Will it ever give them back?" Edward's silence was the answer. The family moved upward into the fading storm, carrying scars unseen, bound by the truth that survival is only another word for waiting. The narrator whispered, "The storm does not leave. It remains in silence." The family stood at the ridge's edge, the valley drowned beneath them. Edward stared at the endless flood, his eyes dark with weight. Martha held Lily close, her arms trembling from exhaustion. Daniel whispered, "It's still moving." Edward replied, "It will never stop." The narrator explained that nature does not mourn its destruction, it simply continues. The water glistened under weak daylight, carrying broken trees, shattered earth, and forgotten lives. The family's breath steamed in the cold, their silence louder than the storm itself. The narrator said, "Survival is not freedom, only remembrance." The narrator whispered, "Echoes live where words fail." Edward lifted Daniel onto firmer stone, his hands still raw and bleeding. Martha brushed wet hair from Lily's eyes, whispering, "You are safe now." But Lily asked, "For how long?" The narrator explained that innocence never survives untouched. Even a child learns the weight of storms. Edward closed his eyes, shoulders heavy with the burden of survival. The valley below churned, a graveyard in motion. The family stood small, fragile figures against an endless expanse. The narrator said, "Survival is borrowed time, and every breath carries the cost of what was lost." The narrator whispered, "The echo of survival is grief." Daniel looked at his father and asked, "What if it comes again?" Edward's voice cracked, "Then we face it again." Martha closed her eyes, pressing her lips to Lily's damp forehead. The narrator explained that loss is never silent, it whispers through every survivor's breath. The drowned forest groaned under the weight of the current, debris colliding in a rhythm that sounded like memory breaking apart. Lily whispered, "I hear it calling." Edward tightened his arm around Daniel, whispering back, "We do not answer." The narrator said, "What remains is not victory, but the silence of what is gone." The narrator said, "The storm's echo is eternal. It carves itself into blood." Edward helped Martha to her feet, her body trembling but unbroken. Lily clung to her mother's side, face pale, eyes hollow. Daniel's small hands gripped Edward's wrist, refusing to let go. The ridge ahead wound upward into mist, offering no refuge, only distance. Edward whispered, "We move." Martha nodded silently, her gaze lost in the horizon. The narrator explained that nature gives no endings, only continuations written in scars. The family walked on, their fragile silhouettes vanishing into mist, carrying with them the echo of the night. The river swallowed the world. The narrator declared, "The final echo is silence, sharp, unforgettable." The family stopped once more, turning toward the drowned valley. Edward's eyes glistened, his face hard. Martha whispered, "It will never leave us." Daniel leaned into his father's side, silent. Lily whispered softly, "The river remembers." The narrator explained that endings are not gentle. They strike and remain. The valley stretched below, endless and merciless, water shimmering under pale daylight. The storm was gone, but its shadow endured. The narrator's voice fell to a single line. "The river swells with unforgiving rage, carrying away the young before they can swim." Silence followed, absolute.